I accidentally exposed my boss's secret family. And even now, 6 months later, I'm still not sure whether what happened ultimately ruined lives or saved them. For a long time, I didn't tell this story. Not because I was trying to protect anyone, but because every time I thought about it, I ended up wrestling with the same question. When the truth destroys someone's world, is it really the truth that's responsible? Or was the damage already done by the lie that came before it? At the time, I worked in accounting for a mid-sized company. It wasn't the kind of job that produced exciting stories. Most days were exactly what you'd expect. Spreadsheets, payroll reports, invoices, expense claims, and enough paperwork to make one week blend into the next. Looking back, that's probably why I remember this incident so clearly. It arrived in the middle of a completely ordinary routine. My boss, I'll call him Mark, was someone everyone respected. He'd been with the company for years, had worked his way into a senior position, and seemed to have the kind of life most people spend decades trying to build. He was married, had a good reputation, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had everything under control. His wife regularly attended company events. We'd see her at Christmas parties, charity dinners, summer gatherings, anything important enough for spouses to attend. They always seemed happy together. Not in an exaggerated, social media perfect kind of way. Just comfortable, genuine. Like two people who had built a life together and were content with it. At least, that's what all of us believed. The whole thing started on a Friday afternoon. We had an audit coming up, and Mark asked me to help organize a collection of financial records before he left for the weekend. To make things easier, he gave me temporary access to a folder that I normally wouldn't have permission to view. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. I expected to spend a few boring hours sorting receipts and matching expenses to reports. For the first hour, that's exactly what I did. Then I noticed something that didn't quite make sense. There was a series of hotel charges that appeared repeatedly throughout the records. At first, I assumed they were business related. That wouldn't have been unusual. Employees traveled all the time. But as I kept reviewing the files, I realized every one of those charges came from the same city. A city nearly 3 hours away. What really caught my attention wasn't the location itself. It was the consistency. The charges appeared month after month, sometimes multiple times in the same month, stretching back much farther than I expected. Curious, I started checking the dates against company travel schedules. Nothing matched. No conferences, no client meetings, no official business trips. Just recurring hotel stays in the same place. Normally I would have shrugged and moved on, but a few minutes later I noticed something else. Several restaurant reservations were attached to reimbursement records. Again, that wasn't unusual on its own. The unusual part was that the same woman's name appeared over and over again. I didn't recognize the name. It wasn't Mark's wife, and it wasn't the name of any employee I knew. At that point, I wasn't trying to investigate anything. I was simply trying to understand what I was looking at. When you spend enough time working with financial records, patterns start jumping out at you whether you want them to or not. So I kept digging. The deeper I looked, the stranger the pattern became. The hotel stays, the restaurant reservations, the same city, the same woman, over and over. Then I found something that made me stop scrolling altogether. There were tuition payments, large ones, private school tuition, paid regularly over several years. The payments were linked to two children who shared the same last name as the woman from the restaurant records. I remember leaning back in my chair and staring at the screen for a long moment. At first, I tried to come up with innocent explanations. Maybe they were relatives. Maybe he was helping a family member. Maybe there was some situation I didn't understand. But the more pieces I looked at, the harder it became to convince myself of that. For the first time, a possibility entered my mind that I didn't want to consider. I closed the files shortly afterward and finished the work I had actually been assigned. Then I went home and tried to forget about it. Because honestly, it wasn't my business. Or at least that's what I told myself. The problem is that once you've seen something like that, you can't completely unsee it. The questions stay with you. And a few weeks later, those questions came back in a way I never expected.
Several employees, including Mark and me, attended an industry conference out of town. The event itself was uneventful. We sat through presentations, met clients, exchanged business cards, and did all the normal conference things people pretend to enjoy. That evening, after dinner, I was walking through the hotel lobby on my way back to my room when I noticed someone standing near the entrance. At first, I barely paid attention. Then I realized it was Mark. He wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a woman. The moment I saw her face, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Because even though I'd never met her before, I knew exactly who she was. Or at least, I knew her name. I'd seen it dozens of times in those financial records. Before I could process that realization, I noticed two children standing with her. A boy and a little girl. The four of them looked completely comfortable together. Not like coworkers meeting after hours, not like friends catching up. They looked like a family. Then the little girl suddenly ran toward him. She wrapped her arms around his waist and laughed. Mark smiled and put a hand on her shoulder. And that's when I heard her say it. Daddy. I don't know how long I stood there, probably only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Because in that instant, every strange detail I'd seen in those records suddenly clicked into place. The hotel charges, the restaurant reservations, the tuition payments, the unexplained trips, all of it. And the realization that hit me wasn't that Mark was having an affair. An affair would have been simpler. What I was looking at was something much bigger than that. Because affairs don't usually involve years of school tuition, recurring travel schedules, and children who call you dad. Standing there in that hotel lobby, I came to a conclusion that felt almost impossible to believe. My boss wasn't living a double life in the way people usually mean it. He was living two entirely separate lives, and neither one seemed to know the other existed. I quietly turned around and walked away before anyone noticed me. At least, I hoped nobody noticed me. The last thing I wanted was to be standing there if Mark happened to look up and realize I'd seen everything. The rest of that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not because I was shocked that someone could have an affair. Unfortunately, those stories aren't exactly rare. What bothered me was the scale of it. The planning, the consistency, the fact that this wasn't some impulsive mistake or secret relationship hidden on the side. This was an entire second life. Two children, a home, Years of financial support, years of visits, years of lies. And somehow he'd managed to keep it hidden from everyone. The next morning, I saw Mark at the conference breakfast. He looked exactly the same as he always did. Relaxed, professional, completely normal. He chatted with coworkers, joked about one of the presentations, and discussed upcoming projects as if nothing unusual existed in his world. Meanwhile, I sat there wondering, how many people can carry a secret that large and still function like everything is fine? For the first time since I'd met him, I found it difficult to look at him the same way. A few days later, we were back at the office. Life returned to normal, or at least it looked normal on the surface. The truth was that every interaction felt different now. Whenever Mark mentioned his wife, I noticed. Whenever someone talked about family, I noticed. Whenever he left early on a Friday afternoon, I noticed. Once you know something like that, you start seeing details you would have ignored before. Not because you're looking for them, because you can't help it. There were moments when I considered telling someone, not because I wanted revenge or drama. I just kept thinking about the people involved. His wife, the other woman, the children. The more I thought about them, the harder it became to ignore what I'd seen. At the same time, I knew it wasn't my place. I wasn't a private investigator. I wasn't a friend of the family. I was an accountant who had stumbled across something by accident. Every time I thought about getting involved, I came back to the same conclusion. Stay out of it. It's not your life. It's not your responsibility. Eventually, I convinced myself that was the right decision. And for a while, nothing happened. Weeks passed. Then more weeks. The secret remained exactly where it had always been. Hidden. Untouched. And little by little, I started believing that maybe it would stay that way forever. Looking back, I think that was the last truly normal period any of us had. Because everything changed on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember the day clearly because it started so routinely. People were working, phones were ringing. Someone in accounting was complaining about a spreadsheet issue, the usual office chaos. Then the front doors opened. At first, nobody paid attention. Visitors came through all the time. But within seconds, conversations started dying out. One by one, like dominoes. I looked up from my desk and immediately knew something was wrong. A woman had just walked into the office, and she looked furious. Not annoyed, not upset, furious. The kind of anger that's been building for weeks and has finally reached a breaking point. It took me a second to recognize her. Then I realized who she was. Mark's wife. She wasn't there for a social visit. That much was obvious immediately. She marched straight past reception, without stopping. People exchanged nervous glances. A few employees stood up from their desks. Others simply froze. Nobody knew what was happening yet, but everyone could feel it. She headed directly toward the management offices, demanding to speak with Mark, demanding answers, demanding records. At one point, I heard her say something about financial documents, and that's when a chill ran down my spine. Because suddenly, I understood. Somehow, she knew. Not part of it. Not enough to be suspicious. She knew. The question was how.
To this day, I still don't have an answer. What we eventually learned was that someone had anonymously mailed her copies of documents that exposed years of hidden payments and financial records, documents that connected Mark to another household, another woman, another set of children. When the rumors first started spreading through the office, I was terrified people would assume I'd been responsible. After all, I'd had access to some of those records. I'd seen things other employees hadn't. But I genuinely wasn't the one who sent them. In fact, I was just as surprised as everyone else. The difference was that I already knew what those documents were likely to reveal, and I knew exactly how bad things were about to get. Security was eventually called. Managers started scrambling to contain the situation. People whispered in hallways. Phones buzzed nonstop. Nobody was concentrating on work anymore. The entire building felt like it was holding its breath. At some point that afternoon, Mark arrived. I didn't witness the conversation personally. Most of it happened behind closed doors. But everyone knew when they finally came face to face. The tension was impossible to miss. Shortly afterward, both of them left the building. Neither returned that day. The next morning, Mark didn't show up. The day after that, he still wasn't there. Then 3 days later, the company sent an email to all employees. It was short, professional, carefully worded. Mark had resigned, effective immediately, due to personal reasons. That was all it said. No details, no explanations, no mention of the chaos that had unfolded behind the scenes. But by then, rumors were spreading faster than anyone could control them. And over the following weeks, the full story finally started to emerge. What people discovered was somehow even worse than most of us had imagined. Because the woman in the other city wasn't simply a girlfriend. She wasn't an occasional affair. She wasn't someone he'd secretly dated for a few months. She was, for all practical purposes, a second wife. And the deeper people looked, the more impossible the situation seemed. For 4 years, Mark had maintained 2 completely separate families, 2 homes, 2 relationships, 2 versions of himself. And somehow neither side knew the other existed. Both women believed they were building a future with him. Both believed they were in committed relationships. Both trusted him completely. Neither knew they were sharing the same man. When that truth finally came out, everything collapsed. In the weeks that followed, the office became a strange place. Officially, everyone was supposed to move on. Mark was gone. A replacement was eventually appointed. Projects continued. Meetings continued. Deadlines continued. On paper, it was business as usual. In reality, nobody could stop talking about what had happened. Every lunch break seemed to circle back to the same topic. Every whispered hallway conversation eventually led back to Mark. Not because people enjoyed gossip. At least, not entirely. I think most of us were trying to understand how someone could maintain a lie that large for so long. The more details that surfaced, the more unbelievable the situation became. Apparently, Mark had been dividing his time with almost military precision. Certain weekends belonged to one family. Certain weekdays belonged to another. Business trips often weren't business trips at all. They were opportunities to move between 2 completely separate worlds. The logistics alone seemed exhausting. What shocked people most wasn't the affair itself.
It was the commitment. An affair suggests recklessness, temporary decisions, poor judgment. This felt different. This required planning, years of planning. Every holiday, every birthday, every anniversary, every excuse, every explanation. Thousands of individual lies stacked on top of one another. And somehow he managed to keep them standing for 4 years. As more information emerged, the consequences grew worse. Mark's wife filed for divorce almost immediately. That part surprised nobody. What did surprise people was learning that the other woman left him too. For years, she'd believed she was building a future with him. She believed they were a family. Then, almost overnight, she discovered she had been sharing that life with someone she'd never even met. By all accounts, she ended the relationship the moment she learned the truth. Just like that, both families were gone. But the personal fallout wasn't the only problem. The company launched an internal investigation after questions were raised about certain expenses. I never learned every detail, and honestly, I didn't want to. But rumors suggested some trips and reimbursements had been filed under questionable circumstances. Whether anything illegal occurred, I don't know. What I do know is that the investigation only added to the damage. Within a matter of weeks, the man who had spent years building his reputation lost nearly all of it. Friends distanced themselves, professional relationships disappeared. People who had admired him suddenly wanted nothing to do with him. The last reliable information I ever heard was that he sold his house, packed up his belongings, and moved out of state. After that, the trail went cold. No one seemed to know where he went, and eventually people stopped asking. At first, I thought that would be the end of the story. The secret had been exposed, the consequences had arrived, life moved on. But there was one part of it I couldn't stop thinking about. Not Mark, not the scandal, not the office chaos. The people left behind, particularly the children. Because unlike the adults, they never chose any of this. They didn't create the lies. They simply inherited the consequences. Sometimes I'd find myself wondering what those conversations must have been like. How do you explain something like that to a child? How do you explain that the life they thought they understood wasn't what it seemed? I never found an answer. And maybe there isn't one. A couple of months passed. The story gradually faded from everyday conversation. New projects arrived. New office drama replaced the old office drama. Life did what it always does. It moved forward. Then, one Saturday afternoon, I was loading groceries into my car when I heard someone call my name. At first, I assumed it was someone from work. I turned around casually. Then I froze. Standing a few feet away was Mark's wife. For a moment, neither of us said anything. And I'll be honest, I immediately felt nervous. My mind started racing. I wondered if she'd somehow connected me to the financial records. I wondered if she believed I'd known more than I actually did. I wondered if she was about to ask questions I couldn't answer. Instead, she walked toward me. Slowly. And before I could even say hello, she wrapped her arms around me. I was so surprised I didn't know how to react. Then I realized she was crying. Not the angry kind of crying I'd seen in movies. Not rage. Not bitterness. Just exhaustion. The
kind that comes after you've spent months carrying something heavy. When she finally stepped back, she wiped her eyes and smiled. It wasn't a happy smile, but it was genuine. And then she said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. Thank you for helping me find out. For a second, I didn't know what to say. Then I immediately told her the truth. I explained that I wasn't the person who exposed him. I wasn't the one who mailed the documents. I hadn't contacted her. I hadn't done anything. Every word of it was true. She listened quietly. Then she nodded. Almost as if none of that actually mattered. Maybe, she said softly. But somebody did. There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, just acceptance. We talked for a few more minutes, mostly small things. How she was doing, how life had been lately. But there was one thing I noticed the entire time. She looked different. Not happier. That would be the wrong word. She'd lost a marriage. Her future had changed overnight. There was obviously pain there. A lot of it. But beneath the heartbreak, there was something else. Relief. For the first time since all of this had started, she looked like someone who no longer had to live with uncertainty. The lies were gone. The questions were gone. The confusion was gone. The truth had hurt her, but at least she finally knew it. After we said goodbye, I sat in my car for several minutes before driving home. And the more I thought about that conversation, the more one question kept returning. Had the truth really destroyed her life? From the outside, it certainly looked that way. A marriage ended. 2 families fell apart. Children got caught in the middle. Careers collapsed. Entire futures changed course. It's easy to look at all of that and blame the moment the secret was exposed. But the more distance I got from the situation, the harder that explanation became to accept. Because the truth didn't create any of those problems. The second family already existed. The lies already existed. The deception was already happening every single day. The only thing that changed was that people finally knew about it. And maybe that's why her words stayed with me. Not because she thanked me, but because she seemed grateful that the uncertainty was over. Grateful that she no longer had to unknowingly build her life on top of a lie. Even if learning the truth came at a terrible cost. To this day, I still don't know who sent those documents. I don't know whether it was a coworker, a friend, a relative, or someone else entirely. Part of me is still curious, but another part of me thinks it doesn't matter. Because eventually, the story stopped being about who exposed the secret. It became about the secret itself. And whether some truths are worth knowing, even when they hurt. Personally, I've never found a perfect answer. All I know is this. The lie lasted 4 years. The truth lasted 1 afternoon. And only one of those things was powerful enough to bring everything crashing down. So maybe the real question isn't whether the secret should have been exposed. Maybe the real question is,
whether a life built on deception can ever truly survive forever. And that's something I still think about 6 months later.